The air in the grand ballroom of the Astor Grand was a crushing weight of perfume and ambition. 20 stories above the muted roar of Manhattan, the city's elite had gathered, a shimmering constellation of inherited wealth and hard-won power. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears, their cold light catching on the anxious glitter of diamonds at throats and wrists. Malcolm Carter stood near the edge of the room, a discreet island of stillness in a swirling sea of silk and tuxedos. He held a glass of sparkling water, the condensation cool against his fingers. His posture, a study in relaxed control that belied the tension coiling in his gut. Tonight was the culmination of a decade of relentless work. The Carter Global Foundation, the philanthropic arm of his sprawling tech empire, was being honored with the Vanguard Award for Social Innovation. More importantly, he was being honored. Malcolm Carter, the boy from the rusted-out heart of the industrial Midwest, was about to be anointed by the very society that had once been an impenetrable fortress. He wore a bespoke navy suit, the fabric a whisper of quality, rather than a shout of branding. It was a uniform he had perfected over the years, understated, impeccable, a quiet armor against the assumptions that still followed him like a shadow. He could feel the eyes on him, the mix of curiosity, admiration, and, from certain corners, a thinly veiled resentment. He was new money, a disruptor who had built his fortune on code and logic, not on the hallowed ground of ancestral bonds and backroom deals that defined the world of his primary rival, Vance Industries. A polite cough brought him back. It was Marcus Thorne, the evening's master of ceremonies, a man whose silver hair and benevolent smile were a fixture at every significant philanthropic event in the city. 5 minutes. Malcolm, Marcus said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. Are you ready to make them weep with your humility? Malcolm offered a thin smile. I'll do my best not to bore them. Marcus, that's the most I can promise. Nonsense. Your story is what this city is all about, or what it's supposed to be about. Anyway, Marcus squeezed his shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that felt both genuine and performative. Like everything else in this room. Just be prepared. The Grande Dame is in attendance tonight. She looks particularly regal. Marcus nodded discreetly towards a table at the center of the room. There, holding court, sat Eleanor Vance. She was the matriarch of the Vance dynasty, a woman whose influence was woven into the very fabric of New York's financial and social landscape. Dressed in a severe, elegant gown of emerald green, with a legendary emerald necklace resting on her clavicle, she looked less like a guest and more like a queen surveying her dominion. Her posture was ramrod straight, her expression a mask of polite, glacial indifference, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. Malcolm's gaze met hers for a fleeting second across the crowded room. There was no warmth in her look, only a cool, appraising assessment, the kind a biologist might give a specimen under a microscope. Their rivalry was the stuff of financial news legend Carter's agile tech firm, Innovate, consistently outmaneuvering Vance Industries' legacy manufacturing conglomerate. He had acquired companies she had coveted, poached talent she had groomed, and, most unforgivably, had surpassed her family's philanthropic contributions for the past 3 years running. To Eleanor Vance, Malcolm Carter was not just a competitor, he was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order. He turned his attention back to the stage, where a video montage had begun to play, chronicling the Foundation's work STEM labs in underserved schools, clean water initiatives in forgotten rural towns, job training programs that had revitalized communities, just like the one he had grown up in. He saw his own face flash on the screen, younger, hungrier, his tie perpetually loosened as he sketched algorithms on a whiteboard. It felt like a lifetime ago. And now, Marcus's voice boomed from the stage, pulling the room to attention. It is my distinct honor to present this year's Vanguard Award to a man whose vision is matched only by his generosity. A true leader who has shown us that the most powerful force for change is not just capital, but compassion. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Malcolm Carter. A wave of applause, warm and resounding, filled the ballroom. Malcolm felt a genuine, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He straightened his tie, placed his glass on a passing waiter's tray, and began his walk toward the stage. The path felt 1,000 miles long. Each step a measure of the distance he had traveled from the soot-stained streets of his childhood. He passed tables of smiling faces. People who had once closed doors on him now applauding his ascent. It was the pinnacle. The moment of acceptance he had worked for, fought for, bled for. He was 10 feet from the stairs leading to the stage when a single, clear voice cut through the applause, amplified by the room's impeccable acoustics. Marcus, if I may have a word before Mr. Carter accepts. The applause faltered, then died completely. Every head in the room turned. Eleanor Vance was on her feet, gliding towards a secondary microphone on the floor with the unhurried grace of a predator. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Unscheduled announcements were simply not done at an event of this magnitude. It was a breach of protocol so profound, it bordered on aggression. Marcus Thorne looked flustered, his polished MC's smile frozen on his face. Eleanor, my dear, the schedule is quite tight. This will only take a moment, she said, her voice smooth as polished marble, but with an undercurrent of something sharp and dangerous. She reached the microphone, her emeralds flashing under the lights. She looked not at Marcus, but directly at Malcolm, her eyes devoid of all pretense of civility. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a single, sharp gasp from the back. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. Malcolm stopped where he stood, his hand hovering just above the railing of the stage stairs. His face remained a mask of calm, but inside, a cold, familiar dread began to uncoil. He had seen this look in her eyes before, in boardrooms and at tense negotiations. It was the look of a person who had decided to burn everything to the ground, starting with him. Eleanor Vance tapped the microphone once, a sound that echoed through the cavernous ballroom like a judge's gavel. The assembled guests leaned forward, a collective held breath of anticipation and morbid curiosity. I have always believed that philanthropy, at its heart, must be an act of truth, she began, her voice resonating with the practiced cadence of a lifetime of public speaking. We gather in these beautiful rooms to celebrate generosity, to honor those who build, who create, who lift our society higher. But we must be vigilant that the foundations upon which these good works are built are not themselves rotten with deceit. A nervous cough broke the silence. Marcus Thorne took a half-step toward her, a silent plea in his eyes, but she ignored him completely. Her focus was a laser beam fixed on Malcolm. For months, the financial world has marveled at the meteoric rise of Innovate. She continued, her tone shifting from philosophical to pointedly analytical. We've been told it's the story of a brilliant mind, a visionary who could see the future. But I have come to believe it is a story of a different kind of talent altogether. She paused, letting the insinuation hang in the air. Malcolm felt the heat of 1,000 eyes on him. He kept his hands loose at his sides, his breathing even. He would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Not yet. I have in my possession, Eleanor announced, her voice hardening, internal documents, design schematics, and confidential marketing strategies from one of my own subsidiary companies, Patriot Robotics. Documents that were stolen over a year ago. These documents detail the proprietary guidance systems for our next generation of automated logistics hardware, a project we had invested 9 figures in, only to see it inexplicably stall. She produced a sleek, silver data chip from the small clutch she carried, holding it up for the room to see. It glinted in the light like a weapon. Imagine my surprise when, 6 months later, Mr. Carter's company, Innovate, launched its own flagship product, Odyssey, to universal acclaim, a product whose core technology bears a striking, and impossible, resemblance to the very blueprints that were stolen from us. Gasps rippled through the audience. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Corporate espionage. At this level, can she prove it? The atmosphere of celebration had curdled into one of suspicion and scandal. Eleanor pressed her advantage, her voice laced with righteous indignation. This award celebrates innovation. But what innovation is there in theft? What honor is there in building a legacy on stolen blueprints? She then delivered the final, devastating blow. Her words coded, but clear to everyone in that room who understood the subtle language of class and lineage. It is remarkable, truly, how far some people will go to escape the shadow of their past. But a gilded cage is still a cage, and a fortune built on fraud will eventually collapse under the weight of its own lies. The reference was unmistakable. The shadow of their past. His past. The son of a laid-off factory worker from a dying town. The scholarship kid who had clawed his way into rooms like this. She wasn't just accusing him of a crime. She was invalidating his entire existence, framing his success as the desperate act of an imposter. As her words washed over him, the opulent ballroom seemed to dissolve. The crystal chandeliers blurred. The murmuring crowd faded into a dull roar. And, for a heart-stopping second, Malcolm was no longer a 38-year-old titan of industry. He was 12 years old again, standing in the cold, linoleum-floored office of his middle school principal. A wallet had gone missing from the teacher's lounge. It contained $200. He, Malcolm, had been seen nearby, cleaning the chalkboards during his lunch break, a chore he did to earn extra credit. He was the only one there. The principal, a tired man with weary eyes, didn't yell. It was worse than that. He spoke with a sense of sad, foregone conclusion. Son, I know things are tough at home. A little extra money can seem like the answer. Malcolm had tried to deny it, his voice tight with a helpless, burning shame. I didn't take it. I would never take anything. But the principal just sighed. There's no one else it could have been. Malcolm, it's better to just admit it. He hadn't admitted it. He had stood there, silent, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white, while his reputation was dismantled in front of him. They never found the wallet. The real thief, another student, confessed weeks later. But the damage was done. The accusation, the assumption of his guilt based on the worn-out soles of his shoes and the free lunch ticket in his pocket, had branded him. He had learned a brutal lesson that day. When you come from nothing, your innocence is always provisional. A sharp intake of breath from someone nearby pulled him back to the present. The memory, vivid and painful, receded, but the feeling remained the cold, metallic taste of injustice. His outward composure, however, did not break. He had learned since he was 12. He had learned to build walls of discipline and control around that core of remembered pain. He slowly raised his head, his gaze meeting Eleanor's across the suddenly silent room. There was a flicker of triumph in her eyes, the satisfaction of a perfectly executed attack. She expected him to erupt, to deny, to crumble. Instead, Malcolm turned his body, not towards her, but towards the visibly panicked Marcus Thorne. His voice, when he finally spoke, was unnervingly calm, almost conversational, yet it carried to every corner of the ballroom. "Marcus," he asked, his tone precise and deliberate, "is it now standard practice for the Astor Philanthropic Society to allow the schedule to be disrupted for the airing of personal grievances?" The question was a masterful redirection. It was not a defense, but a challenge to the proceedings themselves. It subtly framed Eleanor not as a whistleblower, but as an unruly guest who had hijacked a prestigious event. Marcus stammered, his face flushed. "No, of course not. Malcolm, Eleanor, this is highly irregular." "This is not a grievance. It is a matter of public interest," Eleanor snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. Malcolm held up a hand, a gesture of quiet, indisputable authority. "The forum for a discussion of corporate espionage is a courtroom, Mrs. Vance, not a charity gala. You know this. Unless, of course, your evidence is not intended for legal scrutiny, but for the court of public opinion, where facts are secondary to spectacle." He let that sink in before turning his attention back to the audience. He swept his gaze across the room, meeting the eyes of investors, rivals, and allies. His voice remained level, yet it was imbued with an icy resolve. "Mrs. Vance has made a very serious accusation, and I will address it. But not here, not tonight. My legal team will be in contact with hers in the morning. In the meantime," he said, turning back to the stage, "we are here to celebrate the work of a foundation that has changed thousands of lives. I will not allow that work to be overshadowed by a baseless and vindictive attack." He walked up the 3 stairs to the stage, each step firm and measured. He took the heavy crystal award from a stunned Marcus Thorne's hands. He did not look at his accuser. He looked at the crowd, at the sea of uncertain faces, and he knew that while he had weathered the initial storm, the war had just begun. Eleanor Vance had not come here to win a legal battle. She had come to plant a seed of doubt, to poison his reputation so thoroughly that the truth would no longer matter. And as he stood there, the weight of the award cold in his hands, he knew that his response could not be merely defensive. It would have to be absolute. Malcolm did not deliver his prepared speech. Instead, he gripped the lectern, the smooth, cool wood, a grounding force in the turbulent aftermath of Eleanor's attack. He looked out at the audience, their faces a gallery of shock, confusion, and a dark, hungry curiosity. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady. "I accept this award not for myself, but on behalf of the tireless team at the Carter Global Foundation. Their work, their dedication, is the true innovation we celebrate tonight." He spoke for less than 2 minutes, his words focused entirely on the Foundation's mission, a calm and deliberate refusal to engage with the chaos Eleanor had unleashed. It was a tactical masterpiece of emotional control. He ended his brief remarks, received a scattered, uncertain round of applause, and descended the stage. He did not return to his table. He moved directly towards the exit, a silent signal that his evening was over. His small security detail materialized, flanking him discreetly as he walked. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea. The whispers followed him, a sibilant, trailing wake of speculation. Did you see his face? He didn't even deny it. Vance wouldn't risk this if she had nothing. A few people tried to stop him, to offer words of support that rang hollow, their eyes betraying a desperate need for gossip. He acknowledged them with a curt, polite nod and kept moving. He had to get out of that room before the mask of composure cracked. His daughter, 17-year-old Maya, was waiting for him in the private lobby, her face pale with worry. She had been watching a live feed of the event from a secure room upstairs. She was a brilliant, perceptive young woman, already an undergraduate at Columbia, and she understood the nuances of this world better than most adults. "Dad," she asked, her voice small. He managed a reassuring smile, though it felt brittle. "I'm all right. Maya, let's go home." The ride back to his penthouse apartment was silent. The city lights slid past the tinted windows of the town car, a glittering, indifferent blur. Maya sat beside him, not speaking, but her presence was a comfort. She knew better than to press him with questions. She simply rested her hand on his arm, a small, warm anchor in the storm. Once inside the apartment, the sprawling space with its panoramic views of Central Park felt less like a sanctuary and more like an opulent prison. He loosened his tie, the knot suddenly suffocating. "Are you going to tell me what that was about?" Maya asked softly, following him as he walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. "It was about power," Malcolm said, his voice flat. He stared down at the river of headlights on Fifth Avenue. "Eleanor Vance doesn't like losing. Innovate has taken 3 major government contracts from Vance Industries this year. Our Odyssey platform is making her robotics division obsolete. This wasn't about justice. It was a calculated assassination of my character on the most public stage she could find." But the document she mentioned, the data chip. "Fabricated," he said without hesitation. Or, more likely, partial truths twisted into a lie. "She's smart. The evidence will look just plausible enough to create doubt. In our world. Maya, doubt is more corrosive than guilt. It poisons everything. Investors get nervous. Partners hesitate. Talent looks elsewhere." He turned from the window, the full weight of the situation finally settling on his shoulders. She didn't file a lawsuit. She held a press conference disguised as a charity dinner. She wants to bleed me in the media, to bog me down in a war of public relations until my reputation is in tatters. By the time I can legally prove my innocence, it won't matter. The damage will be done. His phone began to buzz incessantly. His COO, his legal counsel, his PR chief. He ignored them all. He needed a moment to think, to let the initial shock subside and allow the cold, clear logic that had built his empire to take over. He thought back to the flash of triumph in Eleanor's eyes. This was not just business. The precision of her attack, the personal nature of her insult about his past, it felt deeper. More venomous than mere corporate rivalry. It felt like hatred. "I need to understand why," he said, more to himself than to Maya. "The business reasons are obvious. But this level of animosity, it's personal." His head of security, a former Secret Service agent named David Chen, entered the room. "Sir, the press is already camped outside the building. We're getting calls from every major news outlet. What's the official statement?" "No statement yet," Malcolm commanded. "Total media blackout. No one from the company talks to anyone. We control the narrative by controlling the silence. For now." David nodded. "And your legal team. Tell them to prepare for war. I want them to file a motion for discovery against Vance Industries by 9 a.m. We're not waiting for her to sue us. We're taking the fight to her. And I want our private investigation team activated. I want everything on Eleanor Vance. Her business dealings, her political connections, her personal life. Everything." "And on Patriot Robotics?" David asked. "Especially on Patriot Robotics." Malcolm confirmed. "I want to know who had access to those schematics. I want to know about any disgruntled employees, any security breaches in the last 18 months. She's given us the battlefield. Now we need to map the terrain." David left to carry out his orders. Maya looked at her father. her expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're going to fight her." "She's left me no choice," he said, his voice now devoid of any emotion, but a chilling resolve. "She tried to bury me tonight. She tried to use my past as a weapon to destroy my future. She thinks she's fighting a corporate rival. She's about to find out she's fighting the boy from that principal's office. All grown up. And he learned a long time ago how to survive." He walked to his office, the city lights casting long shadows behind him. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat in the dark, the faint glow of his monitor illuminating his face. He began to type, his fingers moving with speed and precision across the keyboard. He wasn't just planning a legal defense. He was planning a counter-offensive, a systematic deconstruction of Eleanor Vance's empire and the carefully constructed facade of her life. The humiliation had burned away any desire for coexistence. This was no longer about competition. It was about eradication. The next 2 weeks were a blur of controlled chaos. Malcolm operated out of a secure command center he had established in a closed wing of his corporate headquarters. The official company line was a terse, no comment pending legal action. A disciplined silence that only fueled the media frenzy. Financial news shows ran round-the-clock segments debating the allegations. Innovate's stock price dipped, stabilized, and then began a slow, worrying slide as institutional investors grew skittish. Malcolm ignored the noise. He was a general in his war room, poring over data streams, legal briefs, and the preliminary findings from his private investigation team. His lawyers had successfully filed for discovery, forcing Vance Industries into a legal posture they hadn't anticipated. Eleanor's team immediately filed a motion to quash, beginning the slow, expensive dance of corporate litigation. But Malcolm's focus was not on the courts. That was a battle of attrition. His real war was being fought in the shadows, by a team of forensic accountants and former intelligence analysts who were now digging into every corner of Eleanor Vance's life. The first reports were predictable. Eleanor was ruthless but meticulous. Her business dealings were aggressive, often predatory, but always just within the bounds of the law. There were no obvious skeletons in her financial closet. Her personal life was a fortress of privacy. She was a widow, her husband having died 20 years prior. Her only son, Arthur, was a feckless disappointment who managed a small, underperforming division of the company, a sinecure to keep him out of trouble. "She's clean," Malcolm, his lead investigator, a sharp woman named Elena Rios, reported during a late-night video call. "Too clean. It's like her entire public history has been professionally curated." "Then we need to dig into the uncurated history," Malcolm said. "Go further back. Before her husband's death. Before she was Eleanor Vance. I want to know about her family, her parents. Where did the Vance fortune really come from?" Elena's team shifted their focus, moving from corporate records to dusty archives, property deeds, and old newspaper microfilms. They began to build a picture of Eleanor's father, a man named Thomas Sterling. He had been a mid-century industrialist, the founder of Sterling Steel, a company based not in New York, but in the same forgotten corner of the Rust Belt, where Malcolm himself had grown up Northgate, Ohio. The discovery sent a jolt through Malcolm. It was a coincidence too significant to ignore. He tasked another team with a parallel investigation, a deep dive into Patriot robotics. They quickly identified a lead, a senior engineer named Robert Aker. The lead designer on the robotics project had been abruptly fired for performance issues just weeks before Innovate launched its Odyssey platform. It was a flimsy pretext. Aker had been a star performer for over a decade. Malcolm's team tracked Aker down to a small house in suburban New Jersey. He was bitter, unemployed, and drowning in debt. After some careful persuasion and the promise of legal protection. He agreed to talk. The meeting took place in a sterile, anonymous conference room. Acker was a nervous man in his late 50s, his hands trembling as he clutched a cup of coffee. "They ruined me," Acker said, his voice cracking. "I gave that company 15 years of my life. The guidance system. It was my masterpiece. Then, one day, I was called into HR and told my work was substandard. They escorted me out like a criminal." "Did you leak the designs?" Robert Malcolm asked, his tone gentle but firm. "No, never." Acker's denial was vehement. "But I know who did. A junior engineer on my team, a kid named Peterson. He was always sniffing around, asking questions that were above his pay grade. He resigned 2 weeks after I was fired. Said he was taking a job in the private sector. I heard he came into a lot of money." "And you believe Vance Industries framed you to cover their own security lapse?" "I don't believe it. I know it," Acker said, his anger overriding his fear. "Eleanor Vance was at the facility a month before I was fired. She personally reviewed the project. She has to have known the truth. Firing a senior designer looks better on a quarterly report than admitting your 9-figure project was compromised by a 20-something with a flash drive." It was a crucial piece of the puzzle. Eleanor's case was built on the lie that her company was an innocent victim. Acker's testimony could shatter that narrative. Malcolm's legal team immediately began preparing a sworn affidavit. That evening, as he was reviewing the new information, Elena Rios called him again, her voice tight with excitement. "Malcolm, you need to see this. We found something in the Northgate Historical Archives." She sent him a scanned image. It was a black-and-white photograph from a 1970s local newspaper. The photo showed the groundbreaking ceremony for a new factory wing. 2 men stood side by side, smiling, their hands joined on a ceremonial shovel. One was a young, proud-looking Thomas Sterling. The other was a man Malcolm recognized instantly, his heart lurching in his chest. It was his own father, Daniel Carter, looking impossibly young and full of hope. The caption below read, "Sterling Steel CEO Thomas Sterling and Carter Manufacturing owner Daniel Carter celebrate the partnership that will bring 500 new jobs to Northgate." Malcolm stared at the image, a wave of confusion and forgotten memories washing over him. Carter Manufacturing. That was the name of the small tool and die shop his grandfather had started, the business his father had inherited and then lost. He had been too young to understand the details, old enough only to feel the shame and the sudden, crushing poverty that followed its collapse. His father had never spoken of it again, carrying the failure like a shroud until his early death from a heart attack. "They were partners," Malcolm whispered, his mind racing. "It gets deeper," Elena said. "The partnership dissolved less than a year later. Carter Manufacturing went bankrupt. Your father lost everything. Shortly after, Sterling Steel also began to falter. A few years later, Thomas Sterling was dead, ruled a suicide. Eleanor, his only child, inherited what was left of the company, moved it to New York, and began rebuilding it into what is now Vance Industries." The pieces began to click into place, forming a dark and intricate mosaic. This wasn't a corporate rivalry that had begun a few years ago. This was a ghost, a 50-year-old tragedy that had reached across the decades to ensnare him. Eleanor Vance's hatred wasn't for him. The tech CEO, it was for him, the son of Daniel Carter. He found an old, dusty photo album in the back of a closet, one he hadn't opened in years. He flipped through the brittle pages until he found a picture of his father, standing proudly in front of the small brick building of Carter Manufacturing, and in the background, almost out of frame, was a large, imposing factory with the words Sterling Steel painted on its side. They had been more than partners. They had been neighbors. A new, chilling clarity settled over him. Eleanor Vance believed his father had ruined her father. This public attack, this attempt to destroy his company and his name, wasn't just business. It was revenge. It was a daughter's attempt to settle a score, to visit the alleged sins of the father upon the son. And he, Malcolm, had been fighting a war without ever understanding its true origins. The discovery of the photograph and the story behind it transformed Malcolm's quest. The cold calculus of corporate strategy gave way to a burning, personal need for the truth. He felt as if he were fighting not only for his own future, but for his father's legacy, a legacy he had never truly understood. He flew to Northgate, Ohio, the next morning on a private jet. A stark contrast to the way his family had fled the town decades ago in a beat-up station wagon packed with their few remaining possessions. The town was a shell of its former self. The once mighty factories, including the rusted skeletons of Sterling Steel and the smaller, crumbled brick building that had been Carter Manufacturing, stood as monuments to a bygone era. The air, which he remembered as thick with the smell of industry, was now just thin and cold. His destination was a small, well-kept house on the edge of town, the home of Arthur Peston, his father's former bookkeeper and oldest friend. Arthur was in his late 80s now, frail, but with eyes that were still sharp and clear. He greeted Malcolm at the door with a look of surprise that quickly softened into a sad, knowing recognition. "I wondered if you'd ever come back asking questions," Arthur said, leading him into a living room filled with old books and the scent of lemon polish. "You have your father's eyes. Same intensity." They sat, and Malcolm placed a copy of the old newspaper photograph on the coffee table between them. "Arthur, I need you to tell me what happened between my father and Thomas Sterling." Arthur sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of 50 years. He looked at the photograph, his gaze distant. Daniel Carter and Tom Sterling. He said softly, "They were going to save this town. They were more than partners. They were friends. They dreamed of building something that would last, something for their children." He explained the deal. Sterling Steel was expanding, and they needed a reliable, local supplier for precision machine parts. Carter Manufacturing was the best in the state. The partnership was a perfect synergy. The town was booming, for a brief, shining moment. The future looked bright. Then, the union dispute started. Arthur continued, his voice lowering. It was a nasty time. National union organizers came to town, demanding higher wages, better benefits. Sterling, he was old school. He refused to negotiate. He saw it as a betrayal. The workers went on strike. The Sterling Steel strike had been brutal, lasting for months. It crippled the town's economy. With Sterling's factory shuttered, there were no orders for Carter Manufacturing. Daniel Carter, who had taken out massive loans to expand his facility to meet the expected demand, was bleeding money. Your father, he begged Tom to negotiate with the union, Arthur recalled. He told him that holding out would ruin them both. But Tom was a proud man, a stubborn man. He'd rather see his company burn than give in to what he called extortion. This was the part of the story Malcolm had never known. His father hadn't failed because of poor business sense. He had been a casualty of another man's pride. And my father? What did he do? Malcolm asked, his voice tight. Arthur's eyes grew shadowed with a deep, ancient sadness. He did what he had to do to survive. Malcolm, to save his family, to save you. The union came to him. They knew he was on the brink of collapse. They made him an offer. The revelation, when it came, was a quiet bombshell. They wanted him to break the strike. Arthur explained, but not by crossing the picket line. They wanted his help from the inside. They knew Sterling was hiding assets, shifting money to non-union subsidiaries to outlast the strike. They needed proof. Your father had access to the joint partnership's financial records. He could see things no one else could. Malcolm felt the air leave his lungs. He gave them the records. Arthur nodded slowly. He wrestled with it for weeks. It felt like a betrayal of his friend. But he saw Tom Sterling driving his company. And the whole town. Off a cliff. He had a wife and a young son to think about. So, he made a choice. He anonymously passed the financial ledgers to the union organizers. They exposed Sterling's scheme to the press. The public backlash was immense. Sterling's board forced him to the negotiating table. The strike ended. But it was too late for Tom. His reputation was destroyed. His credit lines were pulled. A few months later, Sterling Steel declared bankruptcy. And Carter Manufacturing, Malcolm asked. The damage was already done, Arthur said with a shake of his head. The bank called in your father's loans. He lost everything anyway. He saved the union, but he couldn't save himself. And in the process, he lost his friend. The final piece of the story was the darkest. Tom Sterling couldn't live with the shame. Arthur whispered. He saw Daniel's act not as a desperate move to save the town, but as a personal, calculated betrayal that had cost him everything. A few weeks after the bankruptcy, he took his own life in his office. He left a note. It blamed one man, Daniel Carter. Suddenly, Eleanor Vance's venomous hatred made perfect, tragic sense. She wasn't just a corporate rival. She was the grieving daughter of a man who had died believing he had been stabbed in the back by his closest friend. She had been raised on a story of betrayal, a narrative that painted Daniel Carter as a villain who had destroyed her family and driven her father to his grave. And now, seeing the son of that man rise to a height of success her father had only dreamed of, she had decided it was time to collect on an old and terrible debt. Malcolm sat in stunned silence, the weight of this inherited history pressing down on him. His father wasn't the simple failure he had imagined, nor was he the villain of Eleanor's story. He was a good man who had been forced to make an impossible choice in a desperate situation. Does Eleanor know this? Malcolm asked. Does she know the full story? I doubt it, Arthur said. She was just a teenager when it happened. She would have only known her father's version of the truth, the version in that final, bitter note. Malcolm looked out the window at the bleak, gray Ohio sky. The fight was no longer about his company. It was about reclaiming the truth. It was about clearing his father's name, not just in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of the one person who hated him most for it. He now understood his enemy's motivation completely, and that knowledge gave him a new, more powerful weapon than any legal strategy or financial leverage. To defeat Eleanor Vance, he wouldn't just have to ruin her company. He would have to dismantle the very foundation of her life, her father's story. Armed with the devastating truth of his family's past, Malcolm returned to New York a different man. The rage he'd felt had cooled, solidifying into something harder and more precise, a strategic imperative. His mission was no longer simply to win, but to control the narrative so completely that Eleanor Vance would be forced to confront the lie that had fueled her for decades. His first move was to change the direction of his investigative team. Forget her personal life. He instructed Elena Rios, I want every document related to the 1975 Sterling Steel strike, union negotiation transcripts, board meeting minutes, local newspaper archives, bankruptcy filings. I want the real story, and I want it documented and undeniable. He also refocused his legal strategy. The lawsuit for defamation would proceed, but it was now a secondary theater of operations. The main event would be a corporate one. Malcolm had long known that Vance Industries was over-leveraged. Eleanor had financed a series of ambitious, ego-driven acquisitions with high-interest debt, leaving the company vulnerable. Its most stable and profitable asset was a publicly traded subsidiary, Vance Media Group, VMG, a collection of legacy television stations and print publications. VMG was the jewel in Eleanor's crown, the source of her political influence and social power. It was also her Achilles heel. Working with his top financial analysts, Malcolm began to orchestrate a methodical and stealthy assault through a series of shell corporations and third-party investment firms. He began quietly buying up VMG stock on the open market. It was a slow, patient process, designed to avoid triggering any alarms. Week by week, his anonymous stake in her most prized possession grew. Simultaneously, he deployed a second weapon, Robert Aker, the fired engineer from Patriot Robotics, Malcolm's PR team, led by the formidable, a strategist named Gillian Croft, began to carefully leak Aker's story to a select group of trusted, influential financial journalists. They didn't release his affidavit. That was being held for the legal battle. Instead, they framed it as a human interest story, a brilliant, loyal engineer cast aside by a ruthless corporation trying to cover up a catastrophic internal security failure. The first article appeared in an influential online tech journal, titled "The Scapegoat of Patriot Robotics." It didn't mention Malcolm or Innovate directly, but the implication was clear. It painted a picture of Vance Industries as a company that devoured its own to protect its image. Other outlets picked up the story. Whispers began to circulate on Wall Street. Was the espionage claim against Carter a smokescreen to hide their own incompetence? Eleanor was forced onto the defensive. Her PR team issued a flat denial, calling Aker a disgruntled former employee. But the narrative had already taken root. The seed of doubt Malcolm had accused her of planting was now flowering in her own garden. While the public battle simmered, Malcolm's historical research team was unearthing treasures. They found the Union's archived records from the 1975 strike, including minutes from meetings where organizers discussed the anonymous source from Carter Manufacturing, who had provided the crucial financial documents. They found sworn testimony from other local business owners who had been pressured by Thomas Sterling. They even found a copy of the coroner's report, which noted Sterling's history of depression and financial distress long before the strike. They were assembling a comprehensive, fact-based counter-narrative to the story Eleanor had cherished her whole life. Malcolm's most audacious move, however, was aimed directly at Eleanor's heart. He knew from his initial investigation that her son, Arthur Vance, was a weak link. Arthur managed a struggling luxury goods division of the company, a portfolio of fading European brands. He was known for his expensive tastes and poor business acumen. Malcolm arranged a chance encounter. He sent a trusted associate, a charismatic private equity investor, to a high-stakes poker game that Arthur was known to frequent. Over the course of several evenings, the associate befriended Arthur, appealing to his ego and lamenting the struggles of legacy brands in a modern market. He then subtly floated an idea, a leveraged buyout. He suggested that Arthur could be the one to liberate the luxury division from the parent company, to finally step out of his mother's shadow and become his own man. He promised to arrange the financing. The bait was irresistible. Arthur, desperate for his mother's approval and resentful of his subordinate role, took it. He began secretly feeding Malcolm's associate confidential financial data about the division. Convinced he was on the verge of his own triumphant deal, he was, in fact, handing Malcolm the keys to his family's kingdom. By the end of the month, all the pieces were in place. Malcolm now controlled nearly 15% of Vance Media Group's public stock, enough to be a significant activist investor. He had a mountain of evidence dismantling Eleanor's historical narrative. He had the sworn testimony of the engineer she had framed, and he had her own son unwittingly feeding him inside information that exposed deep financial weaknesses within her empire. He sat in his office, looking at the complex web he had woven. This was no longer a simple revenge plot. It was a meticulous, multi-front campaign designed not just to defeat Eleanor Vance, but to force her into a position where she had no choice but to confront the truth. He was the architect of her ruin, building the structure of her defeat brick by brick, document by document, share by share. The final confrontation was approaching, and he would ensure it happened on his terms, in a place where there would be no escape. The first tremor of Malcolm's offensive struck on a cold Tuesday morning in November. A regulatory filing with the SEC became public, revealing that a previously unknown investment group, Northgate Holdings LLC, had acquired a 14.8% stake in Vance Media Group. The name Northgate was a deliberate, coded message meant only for Eleanor. Wall Street buzzed with speculation about the identity of the aggressive new activist investor. Inside the VMG boardroom, there was panic. Eleanor Vance knew instantly who was behind it. The name of their shared, blighted hometown was a poisoned dart aimed directly at her. She saw it not as a financial maneuver, but as a desecration of her family's history. Her son Arthur, when confronted, tearfully confessed his dealings with the friendly investor, admitting he had shared sensitive financial projections. The betrayal cut Eleanor deeper than any market fluctuation. She felt her fortress being breached from the inside. Her response was swift and brutal. She convened an emergency board meeting, her voice a whip crack of authority as she laid out a defensive strategy. She initiated a poison pill shareholder rights plan, a classic corporate defense mechanism designed to make a hostile takeover prohibitively expensive. Her lawyers worked around the clock to paint Northgate Holdings as a predatory entity, aiming to dismantle VMG for a quick profit, a narrative they fed to their allies in the financial press. Simultaneously, she escalated her public war against Malcolm. She sat for an exclusive interview with a major news network. Her demeanor, a perfect blend of patrician grace and wounded dignity. She spoke of the sanctity of intellectual property, of the predatory culture of Silicon Valley, and held up a newly commissioned and highly damning forensic report that claimed to show digital fingerprints of Innovate's servers on the stolen Patriot Robotics files. It was a sophisticated fabrication, but to the public, it looked like a smoking gun. Mr. Carter can hide behind shell corporations and legal maneuvers, she said, looking directly into the camera, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. But he cannot hide from the truth. He is a thief, and I will not rest until he is brought to justice. The interview was a masterstroke. Public opinion, which had been wavering, swung back in her favor. Justice for Vance began trending online. Innovate's stock took its sharpest hit yet. Malcolm's own board of directors grew nervous, urging him to issue a stronger public denial. But Malcolm remained silent, refusing to be drawn into her game. She's building a narrative for the public, he told his tense strategy team. We are building a case for the boardroom. Let her win the battle of headlines. We are going to win the war for control. The real battle was now centered on VMG's upcoming annual shareholder meeting, scheduled in 3 weeks. It was to be the stage for the final confrontation. Malcolm, through Northgate Holdings, formally submitted a proposal to elect 2 new independent directors to the VMG board, a direct challenge to Eleanor's authority. He also announced his intention to speak at the meeting, exercising his rights as a major shareholder. The weeks leading up to the meeting were a frantic scramble for influence. Both sides began a fierce proxy battle, lobbying VMG's major institutional shareholders' pension funds, mutual funds, and endowments for their votes. Eleanor's team argued for stability, for loyalty to the family that had built the company. They painted Malcolm as a corporate raider, a tech barbarian at the gates of a venerable media institution. Malcolm's team, in contrast, argued for performance and modernization. They sent out meticulously crafted presentations to shareholders, highlighting VMG's stagnant growth, its failure to adapt to the digital age, and its declining stock price under the Vance family's leadership. They didn't attack Eleanor personally. They attacked her track record. They presented a clear, logical case that new leadership was essential for the company's survival. The tension was palpable across the city. The VMG shareholder meeting became the most anticipated financial event of the year. News vans began staking out VMG headquarters. The outcome was terrifyingly uncertain. The shareholder base was split. The older, more conservative funds were inclined to side with Eleanor and the status quo. The younger, more aggressive funds were intrigued by the prospect of a shakeup. The vote would be razor-thin. On the eve of the meeting, Malcolm sat alone in his apartment, looking over the final piece of his arsenal. It wasn't a financial projection or a legal brief. It was a simple, bound folder prepared by Elena Rios's team. It contained the complete, documented history of the 1975 Northgate strike, the newspaper clippings, the union records, a copy of Thomas Sterling's suicide note, and, at the very back, a notarized copy of a letter. The letter had been the team's most incredible find, buried deep in Arthur Peston's personal files. It was a letter his father, Daniel Carter, had written to Thomas Sterling, but had never sent. In it, he confessed to sharing the financial records with the union, but he explained his reasoning not as a betrayal, but as a desperate attempt to force his proud, stubborn friend to the negotiating table before he destroyed them both. "I did it to save you, Tom," the letter read, "but I fear in trying to save your company, I have lost my friend forever." It was the unvarnished truth, filled with anguish and regret. It was the key that could unlock the prison of Eleanor's hatred. Tomorrow, he would not only be fighting for control of a company, he would be fighting for his father's name. He looked at a photograph of his father on his desk. The young man with hope in his eyes was long gone. But tomorrow, his son would finally give him a voice. The storm had gathered. Now, it was time for it to break. The VMG annual shareholder meeting was held in a sterile, cavernous auditorium in Midtown Manhattan. The air was thick with the tension of a high-stakes courtroom drama. Every seat was filled with shareholders, lawyers, analysts, and a swarm of journalists. A live newsfeed broadcast the event globally. The chyron at the bottom of the screen reading, "Battle for Vance Media, Carter versus Vance in high-stakes showdown." Eleanor Vance sat at a long table on the stage, flanked by her board of directors. She was a portrait of icy command, dressed in a severe charcoal suit, her expression unreadable. Malcolm sat in the front row of the audience, his legal and financial teams arrayed around him. He was not on the stage, a deliberate choice to position himself as an outsider. One of them, a fellow shareholder demanding accountability. The meeting proceeded with a stilted formality, the reading of minutes and procedural motions only heightening the anticipation. Finally, the floor was opened for shareholder proposals. Malcolm's representative formally moved to elect 2 new independent directors. Then, the chair, a longtime Vance loyalist, recognized Malcolm to speak in support of his motion. Malcolm walked to the microphone in the center aisle. A hush fell over the room. He did not look at the audience. He looked directly at Eleanor. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and clear, amplified throughout the auditorium. "My name is Malcolm Carter, and my firm, Northgate Holdings, is a substantial shareholder in this company. We have proposed a change in board leadership not out of a desire for destruction, but out of a deep concern for this company's future. VMG is underperforming. It is failing to innovate, and it is being held back by a leadership that is more concerned with personal vendettas than with shareholder value. He paused, letting the accusation land. Mrs. Vance has publicly accused me of corporate espionage. She claims my company stole secrets from her subsidiary, Patriot Robotics. What she has failed to disclose to you, the shareholders, is that this accusation is a smokescreen? On a massive screen behind the stage, a document appeared, a copy of Robert Akers' sworn affidavit. This is the testimony of the lead engineer on that project, Malcolm stated, his voice ringing with authority. He confirms that the security breach was internal, committed by a junior employee. He confirms that he was fired and made a scapegoat to cover up the company's incompetence. Vance Industries did not just lose its intellectual property, it actively concealed the truth from its shareholders and the public. This is not just mismanagement, it is fraud. A shocked murmur swept through the room. Eleanor's face remained a stony mask, but a flicker of fury ignited in her eyes. One of her lawyers leaned over and whispered frantically in her ear. This pattern of deceit, Malcolm continued, his voice rising, is not new. It is part of a much older, much more personal story. A story that begins not in New York, but in a small town called Northgate, Ohio. He looked directly at Eleanor. You have built your life on a narrative of betrayal. You believe my father, Daniel Carter, ruined your father, Thomas Sterling. You believe he was a villain who drove your father to his death. And for 50 years, you have nurtured that hatred, and you have now aimed it at me. He gestured to the screen, where the black and white photograph of their fathers shaking hands now appeared. But your narrative is a lie. For the next 10 minutes, Malcolm laid out the truth, his voice unwavering. He projected documents onto the screen one by one, the union meeting minutes, the bankruptcy filings, the news articles detailing Thomas Sterling's refusal to negotiate. He built his case with cold, undeniable facts, deconstructing Eleanor's cherished story, piece by piece in front of the entire world. My father did not betray your father, Malcolm said, his voice softening with a lifetime of unspoken grief. He tried to save him. He saw a friend driving his company and his town towards a cliff of pride and stubbornness, and he made an impossible choice, a choice that cost him everything. Eleanor finally broke her silence. She stood up, gripping the edge of the table, her voice shaking with rage. This is a grotesque distortion. My father was a man of honor. He was destroyed by your father's treachery. He said so himself, in the letter he left. It was the moment Malcolm had been waiting for. The secondary twist. Yes, Malcolm said quietly. He did. Your father believed he was betrayed. But that doesn't make it the truth. It only makes it a tragedy. He paused, his eyes locking with hers. And then he delivered the final, complicated truth. But what I have also learned, Mrs. Vance, is that my father wasn't entirely innocent, either. He made a choice. He saved the jobs of 500 union workers and their families. But in doing so, he broke the trust of his friend. A choice that inadvertently pushed an already desperate man over the edge. His actions were not malicious, but they were not without consequence. This isn't a simple story of heroes and villains. It's a story of two good men, trapped by circumstance, who both lost everything. The revelation hung in the air, a truth more complex and more painful than either of their competing narratives. Malcolm's revenge was no longer pure. His father's legacy was not one of simple heroism, but of difficult, morally gray compromise. He saw a flicker of confusion in Eleanor's eyes, the first crack in the armor of her certainty. "I did not come here today for revenge," Malcolm said, his voice now imbued with a heavy weariness. "I came here seeking truth. And to ask you, the shareholders, a simple question. Do you want to be led by someone fixated on fighting the ghosts of the past? Or do you want to build a future?" He looked at Eleanor one last time. The vote today is not just about board seats. It's a choice between two legacies, one of bitterness and deceit, or one of truth. However complicated it may be, the choice is yours. He finished speaking and walked back to his seat. The auditorium was utterly silent. The ticking clock on the wall, counting down the final minutes before the vote was closed, sounded like a drumbeat. Eleanor remained standing, her face ashen, the foundation of her life's great crusade having been systematically dismantled before her very eyes. The shareholders began to cast their digital votes, their faces grim. The outcome, which had seemed so certain just minutes before, was now completely unknown. The fate of both their empires rested on a truth that was messier, sadder, and more human than anyone had ever imagined. The results of the shareholder vote appeared on the giant screen with a quiet, digital finality. The numbers were stark. Malcolm's proposal to elect 2 new independent directors had passed, but by the slimmest of margins, less than a single percentage point. It was not a landslide, but a seismic shift. He had broken her control. A wave of hushed conversation filled the auditorium. Eleanor Vance looked at the screen, her face utterly blank. For a long moment, she didn't move. She seemed to shrink before the eyes of the hundreds of people watching. The formidable matriarch, suddenly just a woman, old and defeated. Without another word, she turned and walked off the stage, her board members following in a scattered, uncertain procession. The cameras followed her until she disappeared through a side door. The battle was over. Malcolm felt no surge of triumph. There was only a profound emptiness, the hollow ache of a victory that had cost too much. He had won control, but he had also unearthed a painful, complicated truth that stained both their families. He had set out for justice and found only tragedy. His team was celebrating, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand. "We did it. Malcolm, we won." He nodded, a faint, tired smile on his face. But his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of his father's unsent letter, of a friendship destroyed by pride and desperation. He excused himself and slipped out of the auditorium, avoiding the crush of reporters. David Chen had a car waiting. As they pulled into the chaotic Manhattan traffic, Malcolm's phone buzzed. It was Maya. "I watched the whole thing," she said, her voice soft. "Are you okay?" "Dad." "I will be," he said, the words feeling like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "Can you meet me at the Foundation's office?" An hour later, they sat in the quiet conference room overlooking the city. Maya listened patiently as he recounted the story he'd uncovered in Northgate, the full, messy truth of what had happened between their grandfathers. "So, she wasn't just a monster," Maya said thoughtfully. "She was wrong. She spent her whole life avenging a crime that never happened the way she thought." "And my father," Malcolm said, rubbing his temples. "He wasn't the simple hero I wanted him to be. He made a hard choice. Maybe the right choice. For the town. But it destroyed another man. This victory, it feels heavy." "Maya." "Maybe that's what real victory feels like," she suggested, her wisdom once again seeming far beyond her years. "It's not simple. It's heavy because it's real. You didn't just beat her. Dad, you gave her the truth. That's a strange, painful kind of gift." He looked at his daughter. seeing in her the best of himself and the hope for a future unburdened by these old ghosts. She was right. His purpose had shifted during the fight, from revenge to resolution. The fallout from the shareholder meeting was immediate and decisive. Vance Industries' stock plummeted, with her authority shattered and her narrative dismantled. Eleanor Vance's position was untenable. The newly constituted VMG board, led by the two independent directors Malcolm had installed, convened an emergency session. Within 48 hours, they announced that Eleanor Vance was stepping down as CEO and chairwoman. Effective immediately, her son, Arthur, was also removed from his position. The Vance family's 50-year reign was over. The news reports were relentless. The story of the two families from Northgate became a modern corporate legend, a cautionary tale about how personal history can fester into corporate poison. The business world that had once watched in judgment of Malcolm now lauded him as a master strategist. But Malcolm took no public victory laps. He issued a single, brief statement expressing his confidence in VMG's new leadership and his commitment to its future as a shareholder. Then, he got to work. He didn't want to see Vance Industries collapse. It employed thousands of people, many in towns like Northgate that had already suffered enough. Instead of letting it be carved up by creditors, he began a series of delicate, behind-the-scenes negotiations, working with the new VMG board and a consortium of banks. He structured a deal. Innovate would acquire the failing Patriot Robotics division, saving the jobs and absorbing the technology. The rest of Vance Industries would merge with a stable competitor, a move that would rescue the company from bankruptcy and protect its employees, but would permanently remove the Vance family name from the corporate letterhead. It was a solution born not of vengeance, but of responsibility. He felt the weight of his father's choice, the unintended consequences of an act meant to save jobs. He would not make the same mistake. He would use his power not to destroy, but to rebuild. The weight of his victory was immense, but as he put the final pieces of the deal together, he began to feel that he could bear it. 6 months later, Malcolm Carter returned to Northgate, Ohio. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the faint, metallic tang of dormant industry. He stood on a newly constructed viewing platform, looking down at a scene of revitalization. The rusted skeletal remains of the Sterling Steel and Carter manufacturing factories were gone. In their place stood a gleaming new complex of glass and steel, the Northgate Center for Innovation and Technology. The project had been his resolution, the final act of his long and complicated war. Instead of letting the old factories rot, he had bought the land and, through his foundation, funded the construction of a state-of-the-art tech incubator and vocational training center. It was designed to bring new life to the town, to create jobs not in the dying industries of the past, but in the promising fields of the future. Today was the dedication ceremony. The crowd was a mix of townspeople, local politicians, and young students who were the first to enroll in the center's programs. There was a palpable sense of hope in the air, a feeling Northgate hadn't known in generations. Malcolm stepped up to the podium. He saw Arthur Peston in the front row, bundled in a coat, his old eyes shining with tears of pride. 50 years ago, Malcolm began, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. Two men stood on this ground. They were friends and business partners. They had a dream for this town, a dream of a shared, prosperous future. Their names were Thomas Sterling and Daniel Carter. A quiet murmur went through the older members of the crowd, names they hadn't heard spoken with reverence in decades. Circumstances, pride, and misunderstanding tore that dream apart. Malcolm continued. It left a legacy of bitterness and pain that echoed for generations. Today, We close that chapter. We are here not to dwell on the failures of the past, but to build the future they envisioned. He gestured to the gleaming building behind him. This center is proof that it is never too late to heal old wounds. It is proof that we can choose to build rather than destroy. It is a place where the children and grandchildren of steelworkers and machinists will become the architects of tomorrow. He then unveiled the bronze plaque at the entrance of the main building. It read, "The Sterling Carter Foundation," with a simple inscription below, "In memory of two men who dreamed of building the future together." It was not about revenge or even forgiveness. It was about redemption. It was an act of grace that honored both fathers, acknowledging their shared ambition and their shared tragedy. It was his way of finally sending his father's unsent letter. After the ceremony, as Malcolm was speaking with some of the new students, a car pulled up a short distance away. A woman got out, dressed in a simple, elegant coat. It was Eleanor Vance. She looked older, frailer, stripped of the armor of power she had worn for so long. She did not approach the crowd. She simply stood by the edge of the property, looking at the plaque bearing her father's name next to the name of the man she had been taught to hate. Malcolm saw her. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. There was no animosity in her gaze, only a deep, bottomless exhaustion. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of triumph, but of acknowledgement, a final closing of the circle. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then got back in her car and was driven away. She had not come to speak, only to witness, to see the truth of his final move, not destruction, but rebirth. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the revitalized land, Malcolm stood with Maya, who had flown in for the ceremony. "You did it, Dad," she said softly, tucking her arm in his. "You gave them both peace." He looked at the new building, a beacon of light in the gathering dusk. He had reclaimed his name, honored his father, and used his immense power to heal a wound that had festered for half a century. The victory was no longer heavy. It was full, and it was meaningful. It was the end of a long war and the beginning of a new foundation, built not on the shifting sands of revenge, but on the bedrock of a difficult, and finally understood, truth.